Hi, it's Laura at Aquamarine18. Thanks for stopping by my channel today. I am here in my onesie pajamas with my last video for Depth Year 2020 and the playlist about that here on my channel. So you'll know from the title of this video that it's going to focus on my deck purchasing and the goals that I had set around that for this year. So I will just mention that what I'm not going to do in this video is go through all of the decks that I bought in 2020. I don't actually think that would be a super interesting video. What I would like to do is to briefly recap the goals I had set for myself at the start of the year, very briefly. Then I will share, I guess, my assessment of how I did with those goals, and I'll share how many decks I did purchase, things like this. And then really I just want to focus on the observations and conclusions that I've come to about my collection, about deck buying and deck collecting, and my own tendencies in those regards that I've kind of discovered or affirmed over the course of the year when I've been trying to pay a lot of deliberate attention to my deck buying. So rather than just kind of going through the list, I want to really focus on the conclusions that I've come to and what I've kind of learned about myself and my, particular preferences and tastes in decks even, and my, gradual growing of my collection. And then I will conclude with my plans briefly for 2021. I feel like that's always kind of the question at the end of a depth year is, are you going to do another one with the same or different parameters, or are you going to do a breadth year, width year, whatever the opposite of the depth year is, going wide, or something else, So I will talk a little bit about that. I do have a plan to make a video for my 2021 word of the year and some of my plans in that regard, so just a brief touching on that at the end. So that is the plan. And I will strive not to make this video too long because I can ramble. So looking back briefly, at the start of the year, the start of 2020, the year that I did not expect to turn out the way that it did, needless to say, none of us did. I had set myself some parameters in the context of a depth year around deck buying and deck collecting. And what I wrote down, and I wrote this all in my 2020 day planner at the back in the lined note paper section, all of my goals for my depth year, and I left space to kind of track them and write down my feelings about them as the year went on. The goals that I had set around decks specifically, I wrote down as mindful buying / low buy. So what I had wanted to do was to really consciously pay attention to my purchasing decisions, and when considering buying a deck, spend more time thinking about that and making that decision. Specifically, I wrote down avoid FOMO purchases / impulse buys. So trying to actively work against that tendency, that I know that I can experience, particularly when it comes to things like Kickstarters and pre-orders and limited editions and so on, buying something for fear of missing out on it and not getting it later. Trying to curb that. And so unlike a lot of people who have done a depth year or do depth years, I didn't set myself a limit in terms of numbers of decks. I didn't set myself a no buy. I was very kind of clear with myself from the outset that that's not what I wanted to do. But what I did want to do is to always ask myself, some reflexive questions about why I might be interested in buying a particular deck, and to kind of pay attention to those decisions, all the while building awareness of my feelings towards my collection as it is, by working with the decks that I already have, and kind of keeping track of is a weird phrase, but like keeping track of how that went, And so I had written down that when I was making deck purchases, something that I wanted to think about was to ask myself Why do I want something? Where does it fit in my collection? Does the deck that I'm looking at buying fill a gap in my collection? Or is it something that the purpose I imagine it serving might be fulfilled by something that I already have? That was my kind of series of questions to think about before buying a deck, with the thinking that this would contribute to a kind of low buy year, as I would also be thinking about, what decks do I already have that maybe I don't use enough or haven't used as much as I could have, that might give me a similar experience or serve a similar purpose as whatever I was considering buying. So that was the parameters, right? And I'm not going to, assess myself too hard on, whether I really had a low buy year or not. I didn't set myself a strict number, and like I said, nobody, I don't think, expected 2020 to unfold the way that it has. Of course, the year that it has been has impacted, my spending and my income and the amount of time I have, all kinds of things. So, I'm not going to be like patting myself on the back or putting myself down for the numbers of decks that I've purchased, but I will share those numbers with you. So, and I will also just mention, since I'm going to share how many decks that I've purchased this year, this is just purchased this year in terms of either pre-ordered, backed on Kickstarter, or ordered and gotten. It's not the number of decks that have actually come into my collection this year. I did have one or two 2019 purchases that I received early this year, the Orion's Tarot and the Spacious Tarot. I did one deck trade. I received one gift, and I received one giveaway. So I haven't counted those because they don't really fall into the classification of purchasing decisions, right? So that's left aside. Also, not all of the decks that I've purchased this year have actually arrived yet. So there is that discrepancy I will mention. So without further ado, in 2020, I purchased 10 tarot decks total. I'm not just going to list them all, but I've shown a lot of them on my channel already. I will mention a highlight for me in buying 10 tarot decks this year. That the first tarot deck I bought this year was not until April, and it ended up being the deck that I now consider to be my soul deck, the Naturescapes Tarot by Tina, who's Queen of Wands on Instagram. And it's a deck that's available on Make Playing Cards that I've shown and talked about my love of many, many, many times. And I feel really happy that it was my first purchase in a low buy year, and in a year that I was being really discerning with my spending and with my deck purchasing, because it was like the best decision. So I'm really, really happy with that. So that was 10 tarot decks in 2020. I also purchased 9 oracle decks, which surprised me because my tarot collection has always been substantially larger than my oracle collection. Tarot is very much my home divinatory system. It's always been, what I've had the most of and spent the most time with and spent the most time studying. So it was interesting to me that the numbers of the two were actually quite similar, 10 and 9. I spent some time this year studying Lenormand, and especially the first half of the year I was really quite intensively studying Lenormand. I only bought one Lenormand deck all year, and it's one that I'm very happy to have in my collection, and I'm glad that I did get, and that was Grandma Baby's Black Gold Lenormand. There are full walkthroughs of this deck on YouTube for sure. It is a beautiful Lenormand deck. This is the backs. And these photos, historic photos of African Americans from the archives, are retrieved mostly from Library of Congress. And it has this metallic gold for the suits and the letters of the suits. And when I saw this deck, I I loved it. And I'm really pleased that it is the Lenormand deck that I bought this year. I only have like 4 Lenormand decks in my whole collection. And this one, I feel really like I have the Lenormand collection that I want now, that I have these 4. So 10 Tarot, 9 Oracle, 1 Lenormand. I bought 1 playing card deck, which was the Contraband playing cards, which is a mass market, like widely available playing card deck. This is probably the fewest playing card decks I've ever bought in a year because I play a lot of cards. So that's kind of interesting. And I also bought 1 app. It was a Lenormand app, and it is the Lenormand app of the deck that I now won't remember its name, but it's by Ciolo Thompson, who's made a number of decks, including tarot decks as well. So that is the roundup of deck purchases that I made this year: 10 Tarot, 9 Oracle, 1 Lenormand, 1 playing card, and 1 app. And that's it. And I mean, whether or not it was a low buy year is questionable. Definitely questionable. Really probably not. But 10 tarot decks is fewer than what I bought the year before. So with myself as the only comparator, it was low buy by comparison. So that's what I had received. And what I really want to focus on then is just kind of how the year went and chat a little bit about what I noticed. The first thing that I have noticed in reflecting now at the end of the year and kind of throughout the year as this has gone on is that I am ending the year with no missed out FOMO feeling whatsoever. You know, there's the odd deck that's come out this year that I have not bought, but might buy in future. Who knows? You know, that I had decided with my purchasing consideration and extra questions this year, ended up not buying some decks that, you know, who knows, maybe down the road I will. But I feel no sense whatsoever that I have missed out on anything at all. There have been some incredible, beautiful decks released this year that I really like, that I really appreciate, that I have not added to my collection. And in no way do I feel any sense of lack around that whatsoever. And what I kind of feel like, and this is probably going to sound weird, and I don't know how to word this well, but I feel like what I've come to understand is that for me, kind of identifying and naming fear of missing out and impulse purchasing as a thing, you know, and naming that and choosing not to do it functions to eliminate the feeling of having missed out. Like the fact that I know that if I hadn't gone through this depth year process, there are decks that I would own right now that I don't own because I went through this process of thinking about, you know, do I really need it and so on. Will I feel like I'm missing out on it later? And I feel like going through that questioning is partly informing the fact that I don't feel like I'm missing anything now. And at the end of the year, the only, I missed out, kind of kick myself a little bit for that, feeling that I had actually had was that, I didn't end up backing on Kickstarter, the Architect's Tarot. The Kickstarter was just at a weird time for me, financially, like in particular. And I loved the deck, but I didn't back it. And I kicked myself for not backing it. And now I've purchased it. I've pre-ordered the deck. So I'm going to miss out on the Kickstarter little extra treats, but that's fine. I feel okay about that. I made the decision when that decision was right for me. And I think that, you know, is ultimately best, right? I think that's great. So no FOMO whatsoever, no sense of having missed out at all. I have affirmed for myself that keeping a written wish list is a thing that I have to do. And if you want to explore the wish list topic, I would really suggest Kim at Abundant Life Tarot has a course on choosing your next deck and curating a collection. I'll link Kim's course below, and it's a free one. And there's a session in there on a wish list and maintaining a wish list. And I went to the Zoom about that, and that was a really great chat that we had. But what I found with the wish list thing, I had always been kind of averse to the idea of writing down a wish list because it's like, I don't know, focusing on something that you want but you don't have, or it would make you buy more things. Keeping a wish list makes me buy fewer things, I have found out. Because in practice, what I've found is that anytime I went to add a deck to a wish list, I would end up deleting something, and usually deleting more than I added. So part of my process this year was, if I'm considering buying a deck, put it on the wish list and see if it stays. See if it stays there. And lots of decks bounced on and off the wish list, and I ended up probably definitely buying fewer decks for that reason. The other thing that was interesting about that and keeping the wish list for me was that a number of purchases of decks that I had made this year ended up being decks that had been kind of on my wish list for a long time, that I'd kind of, for whatever reason, talked myself out of buying, but that were not new decks. So a good percentage of the decks that I purchased this year, like Tarot, Oracle across the board, were not decks that were newly released in 2020. So I ended up, one of the last decks I bought this year ended up being the Gaian Tarot, and I let myself get the limited edition. And so this is a deck that had been on my wish list for ages, and definitely not a new deck at all, but one that I really love, and I'm glad that I finally chose to get after it sat on the wish list for quite a long time. And I feel like it means that it came at the right time, which is a nice thing. Something that I ended up doing this year that was not part of the depth year parameters, but that quite early on in the year I decided was something that I did want to do, was that this year I worked with every deck in my collection, Tarot, Oracle, again, like all, for at least a few readings. I didn't work with them all equally. I didn't do, one for a week and then one for a week or anything overly organized like that or structured. But I made sure that I worked with every deck in my collection for more than one reading, right? To really try to get a better feel for the collection that I have. And, again, kind of initially I'm thinking about things like, are there gaps in my collection that something would fill, or things like this. And what this has done for me, I think, is not so much like that anything was very surprising, but definitely I feel like I've affirmed or confirmed through experience what my deck preferences are, what kinds of, types of decks or particular decks I tend to want to reach for the most. We talked in a tag earlier this year about deck delights and deterrents. And definitely I feel like more solidified in my delights, particularly in the context of my own collection, having done that, right? And again, there was nothing shocking or ultra revelatory in that process, but it was a reaffirming kind of thing to go through. And it has impacted, I think, my purchasing thinking in a couple of interesting ways. So what I have come to realize at the end of my depth here through this whole thing is that the parameters that I had set for myself at the beginning, in terms of looking at purchases and thinking about whether they fill gaps in my collection or whether they're sufficiently different from other decks that I already have, that series of questions actually doesn't make sense for me. And, all things I say in this video are just, with regards to my own decision making and my own preferences and my own, trajectory, and are no judgment on people who do these decisions differently than me. But I found myself shifting, from starting off thinking about, what gaps in my collection might exist, or what, might a deck fill a particular gap in my collection, to instead thinking about, what elements of my collection do I love and work with the most and connect with the most, and get the most out of working with, right? Because that for me needs to be what the focus is, not on lacks and gaps. Because what I realized that I had been doing in that thinking process was I had been stopping myself from buying particular decks or taking decks off my wish list with thought processes like, oh, well, no, like, yes, it's beautiful, but you already have some animal oracle decks, so you shouldn't buy this deck because you already have animal oracle decks, and that's an animal oracle deck too, right? So you shouldn't get that one. Or, you know, you don't need this deck because this one has a kind of vaguely similar aesthetic and you already have that. So putting decks off the list on that basis, but then also thinking about things like, you know, I don't have a plant-based deck, a plant oracle deck, and maybe I would really like to have a plant oracle deck. That would be something different. And then kind of having this sense of that as something I was looking for. And it's like, maybe gaps in the collection aren't actually gaps. Maybe if I find that I have several of one kind of deck and none of another, it's because the one that I have several of is the one that I work with the most and am most attracted to, right? So I ended up kind of turning my own rationale on its head. And there were a couple of purchases that kind of really did that for me. One was a tarot deck that I will say was kind of my one impulse purchase, like truly my one and only impulse purchase this entire year. And I'm hesitant to even call it that, and you'll see why. And that was the Gorgon's Tarot Mini. Not mini. Smaller than the original. It's not mini. And as soon as I found out that this was a thing, and I didn't know it was coming out, I didn't know it was in the works, but as soon as I found out that this was a thing, I bought it. And it was like $10 straight from the publisher, no box, no book, no nothing, shrink wrapped. And that was the impulse buy, right? I found out about it and it was in my cart 20 seconds later. But in a sense, it's not an impulse buy because I already owned the full-size Gorgon's Tarot. I know that I love the Gorgon's Tarot. I've used the full size a lot. And I had previously said things like, you know, if this deck came smaller, I would love it. If this deck was available in a smaller size, I would get it. So I'd kind of thought about it, even though it didn't exist yet, which kind of makes it less of an impulse buy, right? But this is kind of exemplary of this discovery that I've made because I've always been kind of averse to the idea of having anything duplicated, right? Like the idea of having two of a deck in my collection, I always kind of seemed like, well, why would you need that? You know, why would I need two decks that are the same? And this deck kind of threw a wrench in that though, because it's like, but I use the one that I have. I use the one that I have quite a lot, and I know I'll use this one too, while also still using the other. So why not, right? It's not a waste to buy a double in that sense. Similarly, this year, one of the first Oracle decks I bought this year was the Animal Allies 2. And I had a couple of these this year because I also got Birds Oracle 2. And so these are like these sequel decks, right? It's a new collection of animals in the same style, same borders, same backs, so you can use them together as the first Animal Allies. And a deck like this, quite, I love that there's a banana slug. That's awesome, right? A deck like this really kind of thwarts the kind of thinking of, you know, does it fill a gap? And if it doesn't fill a gap, I don't need it. Or do I have something similar? If I have something similar, I don't need it. Because this deck, aside from the animal selection, is the same as the first deck, right? So I can't possibly be filling a gap or be wildly different than everything I have when I have the first iteration of this deck. And yet, you know, it's the one that I'm really attracted to. And so, again, that kind of gap-based thinking does not work for me. Similarly, I ended up picking up the Many Queens Tarot this year by Letty Jane Rennekamp. And this was a deck, this has definitely been out since at least 2019. It was not a new deck this year. And this was a deck that I had talked myself out of buying when it came out. It is a kind of deck that very clear, like, if you know my deck preferences, you see this deck and it's like, of course Laura would like this. I like black and white decks. I like explicitly feminist decks. I like diversity and body type diversity. And certainly, you know, if you know me in person, you know that I am a big fan of leg hair, which this deck is full of. But I kind of talked myself out of it thinking, well, you know, you already have Gorgon's Tarot, and that's a black and white, you know, feminist leaning deck. Same with Thea's Tarot. So why would you buy this when you could buy something that is much more different from the decks that you already have? Which made sense to me at the start of the year, right? Why would I get something similar to what I've already got when I could get something very, very different? But it turns out that doesn't make sense for me, because this has been a great deck to work with. And it doesn't feel repetitive to me at all. So that's been my big discovery, is that the questions that I started out with, thinking in terms of gaps in my collection, aren't actually the right questions for me when I'm thinking about buying a deck. I have done well with, and I'm happy with, and I'm going to definitely continue checking the impulse buying tendencies for sure. You know, I'm really glad about how the outcomes of that have worked for me. But the way in which I do that, and the ways in which I consider whether I want to add a particular deck to my collection, are not going to be, does it fill a gap in my collection and is it sufficiently different? Because they're the wrong questions. They're the wrong questions for me. A deck that's really, 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 really different from anything else I've ever worked with might actually, you know, sure, it might be really different from everything else in my collection, but that doesn't mean it's something that I want, you know? So that was my discovery, and it sounds maybe really obvious. It certainly sounds obvious to me now, but it wasn't at the start of the year. And I think that that is, at the end of the day, for me, the point of a depth year, is going deeply into something in such a way that you excavate your presumptions and you excavate the ways in which you've been reflexively, you know, doing things, and find that maybe they're not what made the most sense. So I'm really happy with that. And I will say, at the end of this year, what I've ended up with, you know, in maintaining that wish list, right? I'm ending the year with a short wish list. Certainly there are some decks on there that aren't even out yet, but, you know, we'll see what happens there. But in terms of decks currently available that are in print, I'm ending the year with a very short wish list. And it is a very short wish list comprised largely of decks that I had previously kind of told myself, no, you don't need, you know, something like that in your collection because you already have something vaguely like it, right? Or it's in a category of decks that you already have one or two of. So my current wish list is not mostly recently published decks, or the most recently published decks anyway, and it's quite short. And I'm happy with that as well. So, all of those reflections, you know, finishing. What am I doing in 2021? Am I doing a depth year in 2021? Not in the same way. I will be sharing my word of the year for 2020 and what it means to me and why I've chosen it in some more detail in a future video early next year. But in the meantime, I will say that my depth goal when it comes to my tarot and oracle for 2021 actually has nothing to do with deck purchasing or collecting or collections. I will be continuing some of the things that I've, of course, discovered this year. Like lessons are things that I'm going to carry forward 100%. But my core goal right now for 2020, and it's not so much a goal in and of itself, but a goal that's part of a larger vision that I'll talk more about in a future video soon. But that core goal is to return to a daily practice and to make tarot and oracle a part of my day again, which it hasn't been for a very long time. I've been quite good at the daily-ish for the past couple of years, or bi-weekly when it's a new and full moon kind of thing. But I haven't had a card of the day kind of daily practice for quite a long time. And so that is where I plan to go deeply in 2021. I feel really good about that. I've considered it in prior years, and I've always found it something that felt daunting or that risked coming to feel like work. But right now it doesn't feel daunting, and if it feels like work, it feels like work in a really good way. So that is where I'm going for 2021. Again, I will say more about that not too long from now. Thank you so much for watching, and I wish you a very happy new year. See you in 2021.